Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richmond, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show, as you know, that brings you the libertarian perspectives on the burning issues of the day. Sheldon, I thought we would talk today about a subject that I think is extremely important for mankind generally, not just people in the United States, and that is, what are the causes of wealth in a society? That is, what causes a nation to be wealthy and prosperous? What brings higher standards of living? We often hear the left talking about the causes of poverty, and it seems to me that poverty is sort of the natural state of mankind. I mean, if you look at history, people by and large have been poor through most of history. I think it's a much more intriguing question is what causes the exception? What is it that makes certain nations wealthier? I had personal experience with this down on the border. I grew up in Laredo, Texas, which is a border town going right up to the Rio Grande. And then on the other side was Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. So it's really just one great big metropolitan area that's separated by a river. But as I was growing up, it wasn't difficult to notice that people on the Mexico side of the river were extremely poor compared to the people on the American side of the river. Well, I find that intriguing. Is it what causes people on this side of the river to have a higher standard of living? So I thought we would explore that today and discuss things, libertarian principles. And I'll start out with the first one, free enterprise. Now, we often hear that America's got a free enterprise system. People don't really, I think, give a lot of thought to what that means. Well, what it really means from a libertarian perspective is that economic enterprise is free of all government control, regulation, or taxation. That is, it's a way of life in which people are free to engage in any pursuit, any economic pursuit they want, lawyer, doctor, hairdresser, shoe shine person, what have you, without a license or a permit. It means engaging in mutually beneficial transactions with others without government permission. And it entails just economic enterprise without government interference. And I would submit that this is one of the major causes of wealth because it enables people to give up something they value less in economic transactions for something they value more. It gives them the opportunity to pursue what they're best at in terms of economic liberty, in terms of business pursuits, trade with others, and increase your standard of living in the meantime. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I agree. I think to put it in the most general terms, when people are just able to set out on the task of improving their lives, their lot in life, in material terms, and there aren't these institutional barriers to that kind of activity, then that's what they do, because people generally would rather lead an easier life, a life of less, onerous labor and goods and services that make their lives easier and more pleasant. And so they'll set out to acquire those things. And again, if you have a market-oriented society, people understand that to acquire things that other people are offering, you need to produce something that they'll be willing to take in exchange. And so then there you get the division of labor, you get specialization, which leads to increased efficiency and lower dropping of costs. And if there's no barriers to competition, then you get people competing with each other to provide the best buy to consumers, so that you get a driving down of prices closer and closer to basically what it takes for those goods and services to be brought to market. So you get, all this was described by Adam Smith, of course, in The Wealth of Nations. So we shouldn't be surprised that you would see this progress among individuals and societies when there are no institutional barriers to that activity. So I agree with you that the human race begins in poverty, and if able to, will dig itself out of poverty. So we might ask the question not what causes poverty, which some people ask, but what causes poverty to persist in the midst of wealth? That is an interesting question, and I think that leads us into the institutional and even class analysis of how politics is used to cause poverty to persist.
Yeah, and that's it's interesting you bring that up because that I think the left, the so-called liberals in the corrupted sense of the term, the progressives, have a real mental block against understanding this concept that for example, they say, well, the welfare state is the solution to poverty, which means using the state to take money from one person and give it to another person. Or taking it from society as a whole and giving it to the poor. But notice that they never understand that there's a big gigantic assumption in their reasoning. That assumption is that there's already this pool of wealth that the wealthy and the middle class have. So if you have a society that's just desperately poor, where everybody has nothing, let's say, the welfare state doesn't work. Because there's nobody to take money from to give it to the poor because everybody's poor. So the question then is, if you have that kind of society where everybody is poor, is it possible to become wealthy? And for that society to start having a high standard of living? And we libertarians say yes, but you've got to get the state out of the way. You stop interfering with people. Just leave people alone to pursue their own economic interests and have no confiscation of wealth, since there's no wealth to confiscate anyway. But as people start engaging in the things that they're good at, and they start offering it to other people, hey, I'm good at growing tomatoes. Would you like to buy some of my tomatoes? Well, okay, well, what do you have to offer? Well, I have fruit over here. All right, let's enter into a trade. That gradually takes time. Gradually, people start making money, and then they start saving some of that money, and then all of a sudden, standards of living start to rise in that society. The problem the left has is that when you get to a point where the society's booming, where the level of wealth and prosperity and standard of living is extremely high, the left then says, okay, there's disparities of wealth, there's still poor people, let's start reversing the process. Let's start confiscating from the wealthy and the middle class to give to those at the bottom of the economic ladder. And in the process, they turn that society, they convert that society back into a downward spiral that ends up, as its natural end, an impoverished society once again.
Right, and I don't begrudge people looking around at the poverty in the world, and even the people, relatively few in this country, but the few that live in pretty bad conditions, even in the United States, and are frustrated by that, and are ask what could be done about that. I think that's a question everyone should be asking. I mean, why are there people in such dire straits when other people, have abundance? So there's nothing wrong with asking that question. What counts is, of course, what answers you come up with. And I think where the progressives go so wrong is they don't understand the institutional barriers to eradication of poverty. At the individual and at the individual level and at the level of social cooperation. In other words, why isn't it easier for people to work their way out of poverty in the United States? And also, of course, we can apply that question to other countries where things are even worse. And so it's that they don't think. I don't think they have a very clear notion of political economy, so they're not zeroing in on the answers. They just have a simplistic answer that, well, it's the 1% or, it's the rich. But they can't go much beyond that. They don't really tell us, well, how is that? How has that happened? How does that work? We, on the other hand, can come along and show you precise mechanisms by which people are kept from earning as much as we think they would make in a truly radically freed market. The Austrians, and I'm thinking of Baumgartner in particular, who I believe refuted the Marxian exploitation theory about why workers are exploited by employers. There was a confusion on Marx's side whether that was inherent or whether you needed the state for that. Sometimes Marx and Engels answered one way, sometimes they answered the other way. Sometimes they actually did get it right and realized the state was the root of it. Other times it seems more it has nothing to do with the state in their view. But the Austrians themselves, Böhmerwerk himself had his own exploitation theory, which I've dubbed the Austrian exploitation theory. And the point being, and you could find stuff like this in Adam Smith too, that if there are institutional barriers to competition by employers, but also competition from self-employment and worker ownership or co-op ownership, all kinds of competition. If you limit that kind of competition, then workers are at a disadvantage. It's a political disadvantage, but it's a political economic disadvantage too. Their bargaining power is systematically reduced by those interventions by the state on behalf of special interests, and so because their competitive clout is at a disadvantage, and there's less competition for their services than there would have been, including from, like I say, self-employment opportunities. They will then make less in the market. And that's an Austrian theory of exploitation. And that's something that of course, progressives don't know anything about. So it's never any part of their analysis. We need to introduce them to it, as well as everyone else, by speaking about this.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. I think it's a classic case of where people advocate a certain policy out of good intentions, or presumably good intentions, but the results are exact opposite from what they want to achieve. And I think that principle describes the whole progressive mindset toward economics. I mean, if you take like minimum wage laws, which we've talked a lot about on this show, here's a case where the left really wants to help, presumably, those at the bottom of the economic ladder, from exploitation from the employer and subsistence wages and so forth. But what they don't realize, where they have this blind spot, is that their policy produces the exact opposite. It hurts those at the bottom of the economic ladder. It locks them out of the labor market because employers say, we're not going to pay that mandatory minimum to that certain group of people. And the most notable example of this is black teenagers, especially those in the inner cities. They have a chronic permanent unemployment rate at around 40%. They're just locked out of the labor market. So they can't get their foot in the door. They can't learn how a business operates, learn a work ethic, getting to work on time. They can't watch and see, hey, I'm going to learn how this thing goes so that I can go out and start my own business. They preclude other people from starting businesses and hiring friends and relatives and so forth and paying them a small wage up front in the hopes that the business then takes off. So I think it's a classic case of these institutional barriers you're talking about, but they go across the board. Licensing laws, which the left says are necessary to protect consumers and so forth. They keep people from pursuing occupations. Hairdressers have to go through like 1,000 hours of very expensive education. And so it's really a cartel. It's a way to protect those that already have the permit and the license. And that's why when we talk about free enterprise, we want a free enterprise from all these barriers and all these restrictions. And the people who are going to benefit most in a dynamic, prosperous society where there's a lot of businesses opening and competing are the workers and the consumers, the people in their role as consumers and workers, because they're the ones that are going to be benefiting most from this ever-increasing standard of living.
That's right, and I think we hurt the cause anytime we don't go through the kinds of things you just talked about, reminding people, progressives and others, that it's not enough to just oppose an increase in the minimum wage. It's not enough to oppose the minimum wage. We need to oppose and get rid of a whole lot of other things that make the minimum wage look like a reasonable policy, which of course it isn't. But if we let them think that, well, except for the minimum wage, we basically have a free market, so let's get rid of that. To the extent we even hint at that, suggest that, we're hurting our cause. We need to talk about all the barriers to, like I say, self-employment, but also getting the first job and other opportunities that have been built up over the years, the structural unemployment that has existed. And, we can even get into things like the Fed and recessions, where the recovery is never really a recovery. It's sort of a new new low that's established as the now normal situation, all of which makes people worried about their jobs because the next downturn could cost them their job, and then they don't get back in the labor market very fast, and then all these other barriers are still there. I mean, we have to stop suggesting that we have a free market except for that very thin layer of regulation that needs to be scraped away. The state's roots, which always are in the service of well-connected special interests, go very, very deep, all the way down. It's not just some like thin layer of frost on your windshield that you easily scrape off. It's going to take a lot more than that to bring justice to people who have been so impeded, if not completely locked out of the political system, the economic system. I mean, and of course we need to mention the schools too. I mean, you mentioned black unemployment. We can't talk about that without mentioning the totally rotten excuse for schools that these kids are stuck in.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when the president of the United States won't even entrust his kids to state schools, public schools, I mean, that says a lot right there. I mean, to me, that's one of the real core problems, is that so many people are herded into these government institutions, which I think is just a variation of the Army. They teach obedience and conformity and teach people to defer to authority. And that's part of the reason why we end up with this, omnipotent state that is doing so much damage to the prosperity of this country, both on the welfare state and the warfare state side. But people have been indoctrinated into thinking this is a free enterprise system and the troops are defending our free enterprise system, and all that's public schools. I'll throw in, you mentioned the Fed. I think that's a critical factor in a wealthy, dynamic, growing society, is that you don't have a central bank. You don't have this irredeemable paper money, this fiat money that the Fed's been producing for decades now. This is where the left goes wrong too. They think that more money means more wealth, more paper money, or when the Fed expands credit or expands the money supply. Oh, well, that's making people wealthy, they think. It's the exact opposite. It's a way for the state to plunder and loot people, and it distorts the entire economic fabric of society. People rely on prices to determine their investment decisions, their consumption decisions, their saving decisions. All the Fed's doing with its monetary policies is distorting those signals. And so a wealthy, dynamic, prosperous society necessarily depends on sound money. Now, the U.S. government was founded on gold and silver coins, but you and I as libertarians, I think, take Hayek's principle of just denationalize money. Separate money in the state the same way we want to separate economy in the state. Let the free market determine the medium of exchange that people turn to. That might be gold, it might be silver, but you don't know. But in any event, a dynamic, prosperous society necessarily depends on sound money.
Yeah, and I want to stress the sort of the employment side of that. If you have periodic recessions, deep recessions, if not what we're willing to call a depression, then the people's jobs, for the most part, are very shaky, and that makes them cling to their jobs and be willing to make concessions on their employment situations that maybe they wouldn't make if they were more confident. But if you realize that every few years there's this drop in employment because of of course they don't attribute it to monetary. Most people not understanding economics aren't going to attribute it to monetary misbehavior by the state. But if you know that every couple of years you could be laid off or let go because of a downturn, you're going to you perhaps do things to make sure your job's more secure than otherwise. So you might put up with conditions that you don't like as much. You might put up with supervisors who are rotten to you that you wouldn't give the time of day to if you could help it. So add that to all the other barriers to breaking away and self-employment and co-ops and small partnerships and things of that nature. You can see where people are in employment situations that they would not be in a truly free market because they're unattractive, and yet they put up with them, and I think for the kind of reasons I just stated. So that's an additional reason for getting the government out of money and banking. Now that's a tough sell because people understand so little about money and banking that they can't, imagine any other system than we have. That's all they've known all their lives. And of course, the leading voices in economics that they see on television, or these authorities who come on and are guests on news programs, are all giving a Keynesian, basically a Keynesian sort of approach, which means money and fiscal policy are there as forms of government control for steering the economy. I mean, they're brought up with this idea that the government steers the economy, and if it wasn't being steered by the government, it would be wildly careening this way and that way, just like some out of control a vehicle on the road, which is exactly the metaphor that's often used. So we have a lot to teach people, and it's not easy because you got to get their attention. You got to get them to think about a subject that you find inherently beyond them or boring. I mean, tell somebody you're interested in economics and watch how quickly that ends the conversation, I think. So it's as usual, we have a tough job. I hate coming on here every week saying we have a tough job to do, but we do.
Yeah, but one of the interesting phenomena from the Ron Paul campaign is it seems like this little saying that people were using in the Fed was transcending ideological barriers. You had conservatives that were advocating it. I remember seeing an Occupy protest where people were carrying signs in the Fed. And then, of course, libertarians, we've held that position for decades. And so maybe there is some bright light in this, is that people are sensing. They may not understand it, but they're sensing that this is a gigantic government institution that really just plunders and loots people and causes these booms and busts, as you said. I mean, that with their expansion of the money supply and then their contraction, and and how would we expect any different? I mean, it's what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos, because this is essentially a socialist institution. It's engaged in monetary central planning. You've got this board trying to decide the ideal amount of money and how much money is needed in the economy at any particular time. I mean, it's no surprise that we end up with a society that's filled with monetary chaos and crises and so forth. So I don't know. I think people might be figuring it out. I wanted to throw out another one, and that's free trade. That's one of the keys to a wealthy, dynamic, prosperous society. That is, well, let's combine it with immigration. I mean, let's just say open the borders. End the embargoes like against Cuba and Iran and North Korea, all the embargoes, just abolish them immediately. You don't need to negotiate with any foreign country to say, well, if you drop your barriers, we'll drop our barriers. Just unilaterally drop your barriers. And leave the American people free to go have to deal with, tangling barriers in other countries. And maybe if you lead by example, others will follow. But if they don't, just liberate the American people, liberate the people in your country to travel. I mean, it's possible that Cuba may erect barriers to Americans coming over once we lift our embargo. Fine. But get the government, the U.S. government, out of restricting trade. And the same thing with free movements of people. Why? Because to the extent that people are free to travel and trade and engage in economic transaction with others, regardless of their nationality, to that extent, people's standard of living is rising. Why? Again, because of that principle. You're in every trade, regardless of who the trade is with, you're giving up something you value less for something you value more, which means higher standards of living.
Well, that's right. Trade is good, and as Adam Smith said, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So the bigger, the wider the market, the more you can get specialization and all the increases in wealth that can lead to. So that's definitely a good thing. The problem here in the United States is even aside from us ideological free traders, most free traders still see government as a very big part of trade policy, and it's always been seen that way from the very beginning of the country, if not earlier than that. The ones that were for open trade meant that the government should go out and open up markets one way or another, even by force if necessary. So it was never, they never proposed, hardly anyone was proposing laissez-faire. I can't think of any major person who wanted laissez-faire. The Jeffersonians were very fond of imposing embargoes on the French and the English. Jefferson called it peaceful coercion. We figure that one out. In other words, it's not going to war. We're just imposing an embargo, so it's a peaceful way to coerce, somebody. So the government was always seen as the spearhead of trade, of opening up markets. And as Richard Cobden said, a good principle, when it's touched by the hand of violence, is completely distorted into something else. Just like he said, just like religion is distorted when it's the hand of violence touches it, so is trade. You don't hear many people talking like that. Free trade really means trade free of the state, and I agree with you that there's no need to be waiting for other countries to do this. It should be done here, and we need to teach people, as hard as it is, we need to teach people that opening our market is not the price we pay for other markets being open; it's the benefit. We want goods. This is what Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was all about. He said wealth wasn't how much gold you have sitting in the storehouses. Wealth is access to useful goods and services. And that means that opening our markets and letting goods flow here freely that's the path to prosperity. We sell things, we export things. That's paying for the goods coming in, for the things we want. The exports are the payments, not the benefits. No, sure, the sellers of the exports want to sell stuff, but as a society and as just individuals, we want goods flowing in. That's the good thing. In fact, I don't even like to talk about exports and imports. I think there's only two kinds of things in the goods in the world: the things I make and the things that everybody else makes. So I don't like to look at things in terms of nation states. There's just goods. The one I make, the kind of things I do, and what everyone else does. So I don't like to talk about exports and imports.
I think that's a good point, and because nobody talks about imports and exports between the states. I mean, theoretically, you could have a system where each state's erecting trade barriers and immigration controls, and nobody talks about, is there a trade imbalance between Virginia and Florida, and nobody paces the floors and so forth. Nobody cares. It's like you point out. I mean, it is, and our role as consumers. The more people that are offering us things, regardless of whether they live in California, New York, or whatever, the better off we are. And the same thing applies internationally. This is where I think people have a big middle block, is that they can see the benefits of free trade domestically. We got the biggest free trade zone in the world, probably in history, with no trade barriers between each jurisdiction known as a state. They have a difficult time expanding that concept internationally, which I think your point is great, where you don't think in terms of dealing with people in other countries. You just think in terms of dealing with people. And the more people that are flooding you with goods and services and offers to do these things, the better off we are. In the time we have left, I also think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the importance of capital in a society. That capital is what makes people productive. The more productivity you have, the more wealth in that society, the higher the wages. And it doesn't come through the philanthropy of the employer. It comes through increased productivity across industries and businesses. That the more businesses that are making more real wealth, the more they're able to attract workers. Say, hey, we'll come on over and work over here. We got a lot more resources to offer you. But those higher wages cannot come into existence unless the standard of living is rising in a society. And how does capital come into existence? Through savings, which is why we oppose, of course, as libertarians, all taxes, but especially income taxes, where we want people to be free to keep everything they earn, and that way they save a portion of it. That goes into tractors and equipment, computers that employers are going to the bank and borrowing money to purchase. And that equipment makes the workers in the firms more productive. That produces more wheat, more computers or whatever. And then, as you said earlier in the program, prices start to drop, which benefits everybody in their role as consumers. And so it's that capital that is key to rising standards of living, along with the other things we've mentioned.
Right. It's the technological advances that permit costs to fall, but it's competition that forces sellers and manufacturers to pass the savings on. There's a two-step process, really. Just because the costs fall doesn't automatically translate into lower prices. And in fact, for a while, the innovator who can lower costs, will reap the benefits of that, and have the older higher price, but the newer lower costs, and that's bigger profits. But if there aren't political barriers, and I would put intellectual property in this category, other competitors come along and adopt the improvements themselves, and then it's competition that drives the price down toward the lower cost level. So it's not just innovation; it's innovation plus competition. If you only have innovation, that doesn't translate into a better buy for consumers. I mean, I really like the way Bastiat talks about capital in his magnum opus, which is Economic Harmonies, where he talks about how it's what capital does, what machines do, what devices do, is substitute the free services for nature in place of the onerous labor of human beings. I mean, just think of what water permitted, what wind can permit, what electricity, and and other things, using gravity on your behalf. It enables the free services of nature to take the place of the hard work, the sweat, the strain, the toil, as Adam Smith called it, of the human worker. And then that translates, if there's competition, into more and more free stuff. In other words, you're spending if you can get the same or better product for a lot less money as a result of competition and technological innovation, you're actually getting you're getting free stuff, because what you used to pay for, you're paying a lot less for, which means you're getting some of that value for free. And this was Bastiat's whole point. He talked about how we get common wealth as a result of technological innovation. I think it's the best treatment I've ever seen, really, of this story. So we have a great story to tell about how wealth is created, how people get richer.
Yeah, it really boggles the mind to think what kind of standard of living we would have had we maintained a course of free enterprise. I mean, not totally free enterprise. You and I have talked about the government business partnerships and so forth, but which we would oppose. But I mean, in terms of if this had been a century, the 20th century and the 21st century had been a century where these principles had been adopted in the United States, a free enterprise system, a genuine one, no restrictions and so forth, permits and so forth. If we'd had sound money, denationalization money, open borders, free trade, open immigration, no income tax, it just boggles the mind as to what the standard of living would be. I mean, let's assume that we buy a Cadillac today for $50,000. I mean, we would be doing the equivalent of buying that same car for $10,000. It's just impossible to imagine how much better off people would be. And obviously we live in the opposite kind of society. You've got the giant welfare state. You got the drug war. All this is sucking money out of people's pockets. You got the whole regulated society. You've got the warfare state that's now getting geared up for another round against ISIS, which means the big winner is going to be the military, the contractors. They're going to be sucking even more money out of the pockets of people, thereby hurting capital accumulation. And you got all the embargoes and the sanctions and so forth. So, yeah, obviously the libertarian paradigm is different. We're showing people a way to extract ourselves from this status morass in which the statists have sent us, and how to create wealth in a society where standards of living are rising. And anyway, that's the show. That's the Libertarian Angle for this week. I'm Jacob Hornberger with Sheldon Richman, and we'll see you next week.